Hey guys, how's it going? TJ here with Dead History, and welcome to our next presidential series installment. And we're going to be taking a look at the 37th President of the United States, the man behind me, Richard Milhouse Nixon. Good old Tricky Dick. But first, as you see, I'm flying solo today, so I got to tell you all about everything myself. Before we get into Richard Milhouse Nixon, what I need everybody to do is hit subscribe down below, give us a like and a thumbs up. Of course, leave all those comments and questions. We love the interaction with our subscribers. And then hit that little notification bell so you can be notified when we do release a new video, which, if Henry was here, he would definitely let you know. It's every single week. So now, sit back and relax and enjoy, because we're about to take a look at the 37th President of the United States, Richard Milhouse Nixon, and this is Dead History. Hey guys, how's it going? TJ back with you. Yep, and the guy behind me, good old Tricky Dick. I'm not a crook. Yes, that guy, good old Tricky Dick. But before I get into the 37th President of the United States, Richard Milhouse Nixon, what I want to tell you is he actually is one of the only two presidents that I have not visited their gravesite. Nixon and Reagan. Nixon is actually buried out in California. I haven't gotten out there yet, but I'm still going to show you a whole lot of fascinating things regarding Richard Nixon, such as he came from pretty humble beginnings, and actually he was raised as a Quaker. Yes, if anybody knows about the religion, the Quaker religion, you're going to know there's some interesting things, and I'm going to tell you all about that stuff regarding Richard Nixon. Then, of course, his political rise. He was vice president to Dwight D. Eisenhower, and then he lost that really close election in 1960 to John F. Kennedy. But then eventually he ran for election again, and he won the presidency in 1968. We're going to get into all that stuff. But of course, how can we talk about good old Tricky Dick without bringing up the fact of Watergate? Yes, Richard Nixon, he was involved in the Watergate scandal, which literally brought down and ended his presidency, and he became the first and only U.S. president to resign the office. So I'm going to tell you all about that stuff. So, you did the likes, you did the subscribes, hopefully you're leaving those comments and questions. Now, of course, if Henry was here, he would let you know his catchphrase. You got to get out the popcorn, the soda, the chips, whatever you like. If you're like me, it's the gummy bears. So get out whatever snack you like and sit back and relax, because we're going to take a look in this next presidential series installment at the 37th President of the United States, the man behind me, Richard Milhouse Nixon. Enjoy. Hey guys, welcome. TJ here with Dead History, and welcome to our next presidential series installment, taking a look at the 37th President of the United States, Richard Milhouse Nixon. I am flying solo for this week. Even the, as you saw, the video and the audio portions of this week's installment is all me. Henry is actually currently on vacation with his mom. He's up in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, having fun, so good for him. I apologize already, as you can hear, excuse me. I apologize already for my voice. We just, as I think I've touched on in past videos, I am a baseball coach for Henry's baseball team. Teams, I should say, plural, and we just had the last games of our tournament this past weekend on Saturday, and yeah, so my voice is kind of shot because I'm pretty loud out there. Not yelling, but I'm pretty loud as far as, just being vocal. So my voice is shot, and I do apologize for that to everyone. So, as everybody already knows, you guys know the drill. You know that we start off part one with the early life, birthplace, education, rise in the political ranks, so to speak, of whoever it is we're talking about. That's what we'll do in part 1 for Richard Nixon, good old Tricky Dick. And then, of course, we will go on to part 2 with the presidency and that sort of thing. Now, just 2 quick things. First and foremost, thank you to everyone who joined on the live stream, the presidential grading live stream. Very excited, very exciting. That was something that was actually, I don't want to say thrown together at the last minute, but Thomas and I talked about that, and then within a week we were ready to go and we were doing it. So, it wasn't, even though I did promote it a lot, it wasn't one of those things that was planned for months and months and months. This kind of came all together, which was great. It was awesome. We had a great time, Thomas and I. I hope everybody that joined or everybody that's watched it since really enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun for us. So, and please keep in mind, it's just opinions, guys. Some people get so bent out of shape about that grading. I didn't agree with Thomas on everything. He didn't agree with me on everything. I may not agree with you on everything. That's okay. That is what democracy is. We can agree and disagree, but we're all Americans. We all want what's best for our country. And regardless of what your political affiliation is, whether you're Democrat or Republican or, kind of in the middle, the bottom line is that we all want what's best for our country, and we want the president, whoever it is in office at the time, we want them to succeed and do well. Because in turn, that makes our country do well. So I always find that silly, like arguing over that stuff. I know politics is a hot button issue for people, but please, just take it with a grain of salt. I love all your opinions. Please keep them coming. That's great. You don't have to agree with me. I'm not an expert by any means. This is just a fun outlet for us to enjoy some history together, and I hope I bring some entertainment to the table for you regarding this stuff. So, and secondly, we are almost done. It's Nixon, and then we have Ford, Reagan, and H.W. Bush, and that's it. The presidential series is coming to an abrupt end, as we know, and hey, it is what it is, and then we move on to vice presidents, so it'll be still a lot of fun. And lastly with this, before I start touching on Nixon, keep in mind, this will be more in part 2, of course. I did not see Richard Nixon's gravesite. He is buried in Yorba Linda, California, where he's from. I did not make those 2 California gravesites, which is Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, both presidents, one I'm doing now, one coming up very soon. I will show you pictures of their gravesite and that sort of thing, but I have never personally been out there. So those are the only 2 presidents I have not seen, but I promise you I am going to make up for the lack of gravesite with showing you a ton of bonus footage. I will give a little bit of a little inkling into what you're going to see in part 2. I visited the Watergate Hotel, and I actually stood in the exact room that it all took place in. So hold your horses. It's you guys are going to see some really cool bonus footage. So I'm going to try to make up for the lack of gravesite, which obviously this channel is centered around. So, all right, I'm done. I'm done rambling on. Here we go. Let's get into Nixon. Richard Milhouse Nixon was born on January 9th of 1913 in Yorba Linda, California, in a house built by his father located on his family's Lemon Ranch. His parents were Hannah Milhouse Nixon and Frances A. Nixon. His mother was a Quaker, and his father converted from Methodism to the Quaker faith. Through his mother, Nixon was a descendant of the early English settler Thomas Cornell, who was also an ancestor of Ezra Cornell, the founder of Cornell University. Nixon's upbringing was marked by evangelical Quaker observances of the time, such as refraining from alcohol, dancing, and swearing. Richard Nixon had 4 brothers: Harold, Donald, Arthur, and Edward. 4 of the 5 Nixon boys were named after kings who had ruled in medieval or legendary Britain. Richard, for example, was named after Richard the Lionheart. Nixon's early life was marked by hardship, and he later quoted a saying of Eisenhower to describe his boyhood. "We were poor, but the glory of it was we didn't know it." The Nixon family ranch failed in 1922, and the family moved to Whittier, California. In an area with many Quakers, Frank Nixon opened a grocery store and gas station. Richard's younger brother Arthur died in 1925 at the age of 7 after a short illness. Richard was 12 years old when a spot was found on his lung. With a family history of tuberculosis, he was forbidden to play sports. Eventually, the spot was found to be scar tissue from an early bout of pneumonia. Richard Nixon attended East Whittier Elementary School, where he was president of his 8th grade class. His parents believed that attending Whittier High School had caused Richard's older brother Harold to live just kind of a desolate lifestyle before he fell ill of tuberculosis. He died in 1933. So what they did was they sent Richard Nixon to the larger Fullerton Union High School. He had to ride a school bus for an hour each way during his freshman year and received excellent grades. Later, he lived with an aunt in Fullerton during the week. He played junior varsity football and seldom missed a practice, though he was rarely used in games. He had greater success as a debater, winning a number of championships and taking his only formal tutelage in public speaking from Fullerton's head of English, H. Lynn Scheller. Nixon later remembered Scheller's words. "Remember, speaking is conversation. Don't shout at people. Talk to them. Converse with them." Nixon said he tried to use a conversational tone as much as possible. At the start of his junior year in September of 1928, Richard Nixon's parents permitted him to transfer to Whittier High School. At Whittier, Nixon suffered his first election defeat when he lost his bid for student body president. He often rose at 4 a.m. to drive the family truck into Los Angeles and purchase vegetables at the market. He then drove to the store to wash and display them before going to school. Harold had been diagnosed with tuberculosis the previous year when their mother took him to Arizona in the hopes of improving his health. The demands on Richard increased, causing him to give up football. Nevertheless, Richard graduated from Whittier, 3rd in his class of 207. Richard Nixon was offered a tuition grant to attend Harvard University, but Harold's continued illness and the need for their mother to care for him meant Richard was needed at the store. He remained in his hometown and attended Whittier College with his expenses covered by a bequest from his maternal grandfather. Nixon played for the basketball team. He also tried out for football but lacked the size to play. He remained on the team as a substitute and was noted for his enthusiasm. Instead of fraternities and sororities, Whittier had literary societies. Nixon was snubbed by the only one for men, the Franklins. Many of the Franklins were prominent families, but Nixon was not. He responded by helping to found a new society, the Orthogonian Society. In addition to the society, schoolwork, and work at the store, Richard Nixon found time for a large number of extracurricular activities, becoming a champion debater and gaining a reputation as a hard worker. In 1933, he became engaged to Ola Florence Welsh, daughter of Whittier police chief. They broke up in 1935. After graduating summa cum laude with a Bachelor of Arts degree in history from Whittier in 1934, Nixon received a full scholarship to attend Duke University's School of Law. The school was new and sought to attract top students by offering scholarships. It paid high salaries to its professors, many of whom had national or international reputations. The number of scholarships was greatly reduced for second and third year students, forcing recipients into intense competition. Nixon not only kept his scholarship, but was elected president of the Duke Bar Association, inducted into the Order of the Kopf, and graduated third in his class in June of 1937. So there you go, a little bit about his childhood, and then leading all the way up to his education and his college. Nixon was a very smart man. Despite, obviously, what we'll get into, especially in part 2, with his shortcomings and, the fact of the resignation of the office of presidency, Richard Nixon was no dope. Please make no mistake about it. As a matter of fact, one could even argue that Richard Nixon was quite possibly one of the smartest men to ever hold the office of presidency. When you're talking about pure brilliance and smarts, he was a very, very smart man. And a very hard worker who really, rose in life based on hard work. So that's one thing that can't be taken away from him. After graduating from Duke, Nixon initially hoped to join the FBI. He received no response to his letter of application, and he learned years later that he had been hired, but his appointment had been canceled at the last minute due to budget cuts. Instead, he returned to California and was admitted to the California bar in 1937. He began practicing in Whittier with the law firm Wingert and Bewley, working on commercial litigation for local petroleum companies and other corporate matters, as well as on wills. In later years, Nixon proudly said he was the only modern president to have previously worked as a practicing attorney. Nixon was reluctant to work on divorce cases, disliking frank sexual talk from women. In 1938, he opened up his own branch of Wingert and Bewley in La Habra, California, and became a full partner in the firm the following year. In January of 1938, Nixon was cast in the Whittier Community Players production of The Dark Tower. There he played opposite a high school teacher named Thelma Pat Ryan. Nixon described it in his memoirs as a case of love at first sight. For Nixon only, as Pat Ryan turned down the young lawyer several times before agreeing to date him. Once they began their courtship, Ryan was reluctant to marry Nixon. They dated for 2 years before she assented to his proposal, and they wed in a small ceremony on June 21st of 1940. After a honeymoon in Mexico, the Nixons began their married life in Whittier. They had 2 daughters together, Tricia and Julie. So now a little bit about Nixon's military service. In January of 1942, the Nixons moved to Washington, D.C., where Nixon took a job at the Office of Price Administration. In his political campaigns, Nixon would suggest that this was his response to Pearl Harbor, but he had sought the position throughout the latter part of 1941. Both Nixon and his wife believed he was limiting his prospects by remaining in Whittier. He was assigned to the Tire Rationing Division, where he was tasked with replying to correspondence. He did not enjoy the role, and 4 months later he applied to join the United States Navy. As a birthright Quaker, he could have by law claimed exemption from the draft. He might also have been deferred because he worked in government service. In spite of that, Nixon sought a commission in the Navy. His application was successful, and he was appointed a lieutenant junior grade in the United States Naval Reserve on June 15th of 1942. In October of 1942, he was assigned as aide to the commander of the Naval Air Station Ottumwa in Iowa until May of 1943. Seeking more excitement, Nixon requested sea duty, and on July 2nd of 1943, he was assigned to a Marine Aircraft Group 25 and the South Pacific Combat Air Transport Command, better known as SCAT. supporting the logistics of operations in the South Pacific Theater. On October 1st of 1943, Richard Nixon was promoted to lieutenant. Nixon commanded the Scat forward detachments at Bougainville. It's one of these foreign places that I'm terrible pronouncing. And finally at Green Island, which is also known as Nissan Island. His unit prepared manifests and flight plans for R-4D/C-47 operations and supervised the loading and unloading of the transport aircraft. For this service, he received a Navy letter of commendation from his commanding officer for efficient performance of duty as officer in charge of the South Pacific Combat Air Transport Command. Upon his return to the United States, Richard Nixon was appointed the administrative officer of the Alameda Naval Air Station in California. In January of 1945, he was transferred to the Bureau of Aeronautics office in Philadelphia to help negotiate the termination of war contracts and received his second letter of commendation from the Secretary of the Navy. Later, Nixon was transferred to other offices to work on contracts and finally to Baltimore. On October 3rd of 1945, he was promoted to lieutenant commander. On March 10th of 1946, he was relieved of active duty. On June 1st of 1953, he was promoted to commander in the U.S. Naval Reserve, from which he retired in the U.S. Naval Reserve on June 6th of 1966. So now, kind of his rise in politics. First about his congressional career. Republicans in California's 12th congressional district were frustrated by their inability to defeat Democratic Representative Jerry Voorhis. They sought a consensus candidate who would run a strong campaign against him. In 1945, they formed a committee of 100 to decide on a candidate, hoping to avoid internal dissensions which had led to previous Voorhis victories. After the committee failed to attract higher-profile candidates, Herman Perry, manager of Whittier's Bank of America branch, suggested Nixon, a family friend with whom he had served on the Whittier College Board of Trustees before the war. Perry wrote to Nixon in Baltimore. After a night of excited talk between Nixon and his wife, he responded to Perry with enthusiasm. Nixon flew to California and was selected by the committee. When he left the Navy at the start of 1946, Nixon and his wife returned to Whittier, where Nixon began a year of intensive campaigning. He contended that Voorhis had been ineffective as a representative and suggested that Voorhis's endorsement by a group linked to communists meant that Voorhis must have radical views. Nixon won the election, receiving 65,586 votes to Voorhis's 49,994. In June of 1947, Nixon supported the Taft-Hartley Act, a federal law that monitors the activities and power of labor unions, and he served on the Education and Labor Committee. In August of 1947, he became one of 19 House members to serve on the Herter Committee, which went to Europe to report on the need for U.S. foreign aid. Nixon was the youngest member of the committee and the only Westerner. Advocacy by Herter Committee members, including Nixon, led to congressional passage of the Marshall Plan. In his memoirs, Nixon wrote that he joined the House Un-American Activities Committee at the end of 1947. However, he was already a HUAC member in early February of 1947, when he heard Enemy Number One, Gerard Eisler, and his sister, Ruth Fisher, testify. On February 18th of 1947, Nixon referred to Eisler's belligerence toward HUAC in his maiden speech to the House. Also, by early February of 1947, fellow U.S. Representative Charles J. Kirsten had introduced him to Father John Francis Cronin in Baltimore. Cronin shared with Nixon his 1945 privately circulated paper, The Problem of American Communism in 1945, with much information from the FBI's William C. Sullivan. By May of 1948, Nixon co-sponsored a Munt-Nixon bill to implement a new approach to the complicated problem of eternal communist subversion. It provided for registration of all Communist Party members and required a statement of the source of all printed and broadcast material issued by organizations that were found to be communist fronts. He served as floor manager to the Republican Party. On May 19th of 1948, the bill passed the House by 319 to 58, but later it failed to pass the Senate. Nixon first gained national attention in August of 1948 when his persistence as a HUAC member helped break the Alger-Hiss spy case. While many doubted Whittaker Chambers' allegations that Hiss, a former State Department official, had been a Soviet spy, Nixon believed them to be true and pressed for the committee to continue its investigation. After Hiss filed suit for defamation, Chambers produced documents corroborating his allegations. These included paper and microfilm copies that Chambers turned over to House investigators after having hidden them overnight in a field. They became known as the Pumpkin Papers. Hiss was convicted of perjury in 1950 for denying under oath he had passed documents to Chambers. In 1948, Nixon successfully cross-filed as a candidate in his district, winning both major party primaries, and was comfortably re-elected. And now his time as a U.S. Senator. In 1949, Nixon began to consider running for the United States Senate against the Democratic incumbent Sheridan Downey, and entered the race in November. Downey faced with a bitter primary battle with Representative Helen Gahagan Douglas, announced his retirement in March 1950. Nixon and Douglas won the primary elections and engaged in a contentious campaign in which the ongoing Korean War was a major issue. Nixon tried to focus attention on Douglas's liberal voting record. As a part of that effort, a pink sheet was distributed by the Nixon campaign suggesting that, as Douglas's voting record was similar to that of New York Congressman Vito Marcatonio, believed by some to actually be a communist, their political views must be nearly identical. Nixon won the election by almost 20 percentage points. During his campaign, Nixon was first called Tricky Dick by his opponents for his campaign tactics. In the Senate, Nixon took a prominent position in opposing global communism, traveling frequently and speaking out against it. He maintained friendly relations with his fellow anti-communist, controversial Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy, but was careful to keep some distance between himself and McCarthy's allegations. Nixon also criticized President Harry S. Truman's handling of the Korean War. He supported statehood for Alaska and Hawaii, voted in favor of civil rights for minorities, and supported federal disaster relief for India and Yugoslavia. He voted against price controls and other monetary restrictions, benefits for illegal immigrants, and public power. Then, General Dwight D. Eisenhower was nominated for president by the Republicans in 1952. He had no strong preference for a vice presidential candidate, and Republican office holders and party officials met in a smoke-filled room and recommended Nixon to the general, who agreed to the senator's selection. Nixon's youth, he was only 39 at the time, stance against communism, and political base in California, one of the largest states, were all seen as vote winners by the leaders. Among the candidates considered along with Nixon were Ohio Senator Robert A. Taft, New Jersey Governor Alfred Driscoll, any of you New Jersey people that know the Driscoll Bridge up on the Garden State Parkway, and Illinois Senator Everett Dirksen. On the campaign trail, Eisenhower spoke of his plans for the country, leaving the negative campaigning to his running mate. In mid-September, the Republican ticket faced a major crisis. The media reported that Nixon had a political fund maintained by his backers which reimbursed him for political expenses. Such a fund was not illegal, but it exposed Nixon to allegations of a possible conflict of interest. With pressure building for Eisenhower to demand Nixon's resignation from the ticket, the senator went on television to deliver an address to the nation on September 23rd of 1952. The address, later termed the Checkers speech, was heard by about 60 million Americans, including the largest television audience up to that point. Nixon emotionally defended himself, stating that the fund was not secret, nor had donors received special favors. He painted himself as a man of modest means and a patriot. The speech would be remembered for the gift which Nixon had received, but which he would not give back: a little Cocker Spaniel dog sent all the way from Texas. And our little girl Tricia, the 6-year-old, named it Checkers. The speech prompted a huge public outpouring of support for Nixon. Eisenhower decided to retain him on the ticket, which proved victorious in the November election.
My fellow Americans, I come before you tonight as a candidate for the vice presidency, and as a man whose honesty and integrity has been questioned. Now, the usual political thing to do when charges are made against you is to either ignore them or to deny them without giving details. I believe we've had enough of that in the United States, particularly with the present administration in Washington, D.C. To me, the office of the Vice Presidency of the United States is a great office, and I feel that the people have got to have confidence in the integrity of the men who run for that office and who might obtain it. I have a theory, too, that the best and only answer to a smear or to an honest misunderstanding of the facts is to tell the truth. And that's why I'm here tonight. I want to tell you my side of the case. I'm sure that you have read the charge and you've heard it, that I, Senator Nixon, took $18,000 from a group of my supporters. Now, was that wrong? And let me say that it was wrong. I'm saying, incidentally, that it was wrong, not just illegal, because it isn't a question of whether it was legal or illegal. That isn't enough. The question is, was it morally wrong? I say that it was morally wrong if any of that $18,000 went to Senator Nixon for my personal use. I say that it was morally wrong if it was secretly given and secretly handed. And I say that it was morally wrong if any of the contributors got special favors for the contributions that they made. And now, to answer those questions, let me say this. Not 1 cent of the $18,000 or any other money of that type ever went to me for my personal use. Every penny of it was used to pay for political expenses that I did not think should be charged to the taxpayers of the United States. It was not a secret fund. As a matter of fact, when I was on Meet the Press, some of you may have seen it last Sunday, Peter Edson came up to me after the program, and he said, "Dick, what about this fund we hear about?" And I said, "Well, there's no secret about it. Go out and see Dana Smith, who was the administrator of the fund." And I gave him his address. And I said, "You will find that the purpose of the fund simply was to defray political expenses that I did not feel should be charged to the government." And third, let me point out, and I want to make this particularly clear, that no contributor to this fund, no contributor to any of my campaigns, has ever received any consideration that he would not have received as an ordinary constituent. I just don't believe in it. And I can say that never, while I have been in the Senate of the United States, as far as the people that contributed to this fund are concerned, have I made a telephone call for them to an agency, or have I gone down to an agency in their behalf. And the records will show them, the records which are in the hand. Well, that's about it. That's what we have. That's what we owe. It isn't very much, but Pat and I have the satisfaction that every dime that we've got is honestly ours. I should say this, that Pat doesn't have a mink coat, but she does have a respectable Republican cloth coat. And I always tell her that she'd look good in anything. One other thing I probably should tell you, because if I don't, they'll probably be saying this about me too. We did get something, a gift, after the election. A man down in Texas heard Pat on the radio mention the fact that our two youngsters would like to have a dog. And believe it or not, the day before we left on this campaign trip, we got a message from the Union Station in Baltimore saying they had a package for us. We went down to get it. You know what it was? It was a little Cocker Spaniel dog in a crate that he'd sent all the way from Texas. Black and white, spotted. And our little girl, Tricia, the 6-year-old, named it Checkers. And you know, the kids, like all kids, love the dog. And I just want to say this right now, that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep it. It isn't easy to come before a nationwide audience and bare your life, as I've done. But I want to say some things before I conclude. In spite of the smears, the misunderstanding, the necessity for a man to come up here and bare his soul as I have, why is it necessary for me to continue this fight? And I want to tell you why. Because, you see, I love my...
Eisenhower gave Nixon responsibilities during his term as vice president more than any previous vice president. Nixon attended Cabinet and National Security Council meetings and chaired them when Eisenhower was absent. A 1953 tour of the Far East succeeded in increasing local goodwill toward the United States and prompted Nixon to appreciate the potential of the region as an industrial center. He visited Saigon and Hanoi in French Indochina. On his return to the United States at the end of 1953, Nixon increased the amount of time he devoted to foreign relations. Despite intense campaigning by Nixon, who reprised his strong attacks on the Democrats, the Republicans lost control of both houses of Congress in the 1954 elections. These losses caused Nixon to contemplate leaving politics once he had served out his term. On September 24th of 1955, President Eisenhower suffered a heart attack. His condition was initially believed to be life-threatening. Eisenhower was unable to perform his duties for 6 weeks, and the 25th Amendment to the United States Constitution had not yet been proposed, and the Vice President had no formal power to act. Nonetheless, Nixon acted in Eisenhower's stead during this period, presiding over cabinet meetings and ensuring that aides and cabinet officers did not seek power. According to Nixon biographer Stephen Ambrose, Nixon had earned the high praise he received for his conduct during the crisis. He made no attempt to seize power. Nixon sought a second term after his spirits were lifted, but some of Eisenhower's aides aimed to displace him. In a December of 1955 meeting, Eisenhower proposed that Nixon not run for re-election in order to give him administrative experience before a 1960 presidential run and instead become a cabinet officer in a second Eisenhower administration. Nixon believed such an action would destroy his political career. When Eisenhower announced his re-election bid in February of 1956, he hedged on the choice of his running mate, saying it was improper to address that question until he had been renominated. Although no Republican was opposing Eisenhower, Nixon received a substantial number of write-in votes against the president in the 1956 New Hampshire primary election. In late April, the president announced that Nixon would again be his running mate. Eisenhower and Nixon were reelected by a comfortable margin in the November 1956 election. In early 1957, Nixon undertook another major foreign trip, this time to Africa. On his return, he helped shepherd the Civil Rights Act of 1957 through Congress. The bill was weakened in the Senate, and civil rights leaders were divided over whether Eisenhower should sign it. Nixon advised the president to sign the bill, which he did. Eisenhower suffered a mild stroke in November of 1957, and Nixon gave a press conference assuring the nation that the cabinet was functioning well as a team during Eisenhower's brief illness. On April 27th of 1958, Richard and Pat Nixon reluctantly embarked on a goodwill tour of South America. In Uruguay, Nixon made an impromptu visit to a college campus where he fielded questions from students on U.S. foreign policy. The trip was uneventful until the Nixon party reached Lima, Peru, where he was met with student demonstrations. Nixon went to the historical campus of National University of San Marcos, the oldest university in the Americas. He got out of his car to confront the students and stayed until forced back into the car by a volley of thrown objects. At his hotel, Nixon faced another mob, and one demonstrator spat at him. In Venezuela, Nixon and his wife were spat on by anti-American demonstrators, and their limousine was attacked by a pipe-wielding mob. According to Ambrose, the Nixon biographer, Nixon's courageous conduct caused even some of his bitterest enemies to give him some grudging respect. Reporting to the cabinet after the trip, Richard Nixon claimed there was absolute proof that the protesters were directed and controlled by a central communist conspiracy. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles concurred in this view. Director of the CIA, Allen Dulles, sharply rebuked it. In July of 1959, President Eisenhower sent Nixon to the Soviet Union for the opening of the American National Exhibition in Moscow. On July 24th, Nixon was touring the exhibits with Soviet First Secretary and Premier Nikita Khrushchev when the two stopped at a model of an American kitchen and engaged in an impromptu exchange about the merits of capitalism versus communism that became known as the kitchen debate. So there you go. Pretty cool stuff there. And then, of course, that leads us up to 1960. In 1960, Nixon launched his first campaign for president of the United States. He faced little opposition in the Republican primaries, and he chose former Massachusetts Senator Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. as his running mate. Of course, his Democratic opponent was John F. Kennedy, and the race remained close for the duration. Nixon campaigned on his experience, but Kennedy called for new blood and claimed the Eisenhower-Nixon administration had allowed the Soviet Union to overtake the U.S. in ballistic missiles. A new political medium was introduced in the campaign, televised presidential debates. In the first of four such debates, Nixon appeared pale with a 5 o'clock shadow in contrast to the photogenic Kennedy. Nixon's performance in the debate was perceived to be mediocre in the visual medium of television, though many people listening on the radio thought Nixon had won. Nixon narrowly lost the 1960 election. There were charges of voter fraud in Texas and Illinois, both states won by Kennedy, but Nixon refused to consider contesting the election, feeling a lengthy controversy would diminish the United States in the eyes of the world and the uncertainty would hurt U.S. interests. At the end of his term of office as vice president in January of 1961, Richard Nixon and his family returned to California, where he practiced law and wrote a best-selling book, Six Crises, which included coverage of the Hiss case, Eisenhower's heart attack, and the Fun crisis, which had been resolved by the Checkers speech. Local and national Republican leaders encouraged Nixon to challenge incumbent Pat Brown for governor of California in the 1962 election. Despite initial reluctance, Nixon entered the race. The campaign was clouded by public suspicion that Nixon viewed the office as a stepping stone for another presidential run. some opposition from the far right of the party, and his own lack of interest in being California's governor. Nixon hoped a successful run would confirm his status as the nation's leading active Republican politician and ensure he remained a major player in national politics. Instead, Richard Nixon lost to Brown by more than 5 percentage points, and the defeat was widely believed to be the end of his political career. In an impromptu concession speech the morning after the election, Richard Nixon blamed the media for favoring his opponent, saying, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore, because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference." The California defeat was highlighted in the November 11, 1962 episode of ABC's Howard K. Smith News and Comment, titled "The Political Obituary of Richard M. Nixon." Alger Hiss appeared on the program, and many members of the public complained that it was unseemly to give a convicted felon airtime to attack a former vice president. The Fuhrer drove Smith and his program from the air, and public sympathy for Nixon grew. In 1963, the Nixon family traveled to Europe, where Nixon gave press conferences and met with leaders of the countries he visited. The family moved to New York City, where Nixon became a senior partner in the leading law firm Nixon, Mudge, Rose, Guthrie, and Alexander. When announcing his California campaign, Nixon had pledged not to run for president in 1964. Even if he had not, he had believed it would be difficult to defeat Kennedy, or after his assassination, Kennedy's successor Lyndon Johnson. In the 1964 election, Richard Nixon supported Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater for the Republican nomination for U.S. President. When Goldwater won the nomination, Nixon was selected to introduce him at the convention. Although he thought Goldwater unlikely to win, Nixon campaigned for him loyally. The election was a disaster for the Republicans. Goldwater's landslide loss to Johnson was matched by heavy losses for the party in Congress and among state governors. Nixon was one of the few leading Republicans not blamed for the disastrous results, and he sought to build on that in the 1966 congressional elections. He campaigned for many Republicans seeking to regain seats lost in the Johnson landslide, and he received credit for helping the Republicans make major gains that year.
For 16 years, ever since the Hiss case, you've had a lot of fun. A lot of fun. You've had an opportunity to attack me, and I think I've given as good as I've taken. I leave you gentlemen now, and you will now write it, you will interpret it, that's your right. But as I leave you, I want you to know, just think how much you're going to be missing. You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore.
And that pretty much leads us all the way up to the 1968 presidential election, which we're not going to get into now. We'll get into, of course, tomorrow in part 2. So that's kind of a look at Nixon's early life, his education, his military career, and then, of course, his political career, vice president and then rise, a loss in a California gubernatorial election, and then eventually up to that 1968 presidential election, which we'll get into. Now I'm going to read you just some fun facts, as I always do, about Nixon. Hopefully I'm not repeating anything. I'll try not to. And then we'll, of course, wrap up and end this part 1. So Milhouse was his mother's maiden name. Nixon's unusual middle name came from the maternal side of his family. When the ancestors of Nixon's mother moved from Germany to England in the 1600s, they changed their last names from Milhausen to Milhouse. There you go. Pretty little interesting fact. Whenever I hear Milhouse, I always think about Bart Simpson's, best friend on The Simpsons, Milhouse von Houten, or Van Houten. That's who I always think of. Community theater, as I had said, that's what brought Richard and Pat Nixon together. Nixon first encountered his future First Lady as a leading lady in 1938 when they both auditioned for the Whittier Community Players production of The Dark Tower. The amateur theater production led to a romance between Nixon and Thelma Catherine Ryan, nicknamed Pat by her father because she was born on the eve of St. Patrick's Day. Foreshadowing their later lives, the couple wed in the presidential suite of the Mission Inn in Riverside, California on June 21st of 1940. As I had also touched on, Nixon was a Quaker. Nixon's mother, Hannah, was a devout Quaker who instilled the faith in her husband and children. After the failure of his father's lemon grove in Yorba Linda, California, Nixon moved with the family in 1922 to the nearby Quaker community of Whittier, which was named after one of America's most eminent Quakers, the poet John Greenleaf Whittier. As a boy, Nixon went to Quaker meetings 4 times on Sundays and played the piano at church services. He enrolled at Whittier College, a Quaker institution, and attended mandatory chapel hours every day. Interesting stuff there. Richard Nixon could actually play 5 musical instruments. Nixon's mother insisted he practice on the family's upright piano every afternoon. And in the 7th grade, he was sent 200 miles away to take lessons with his aunt, who had studied at the Indianapolis Conservatory of Music. Although he never learned to read music, Nixon could also play the saxophone, clarinet, accordion, and violin. His musical talents turned out to be political assets. Nixon's 1963 appearance on the Jack Paar program, during which he played a tune he wrote, helped rehabilitate his image after losing the California gubernatorial election the prior year. And as president, he occasionally tickled the ivories, playing Happy Birthday for Duke Ellington at the White House and My Wild Irish Rose in honor of his wife at the Grand Ole Opry. Pretty cool stuff. Nixon, here we go. This is pretty cool. Nixon may have had royal blood. Through his maternal grandfather, Nixon reportedly descended from King Edward III of England. Whether or not Nixon had royal roots, he definitely had a royal moniker. The future president was named for Richard the Lionheart. Each of Nixon's 4 brothers, except for Francis, who bore the name of his father, were given names of English kings. Of course, we touched on Nixon lost his bid for high school student body president. Although president of his 8th grade class, Nixon lost the election for student body president when he was in high school as a senior in 1929. The victor, Robert Logg, is in rare company. The next man to defeat Nixon at the polls was Kennedy 31 years later. In the interim, Nixon was elected president of the Whittier College student body on a platform of supporting on-campus dances, and the Duke University Law School Bar Association, as well as a U.S. representative, senator, and vice president. Richard Nixon was a very big, huge football fan. Nixon played on the Whittier College football team, and while president, he struck up a friendship with George Allen, coach of the National Football League's Washington Redskins. George Allen invited the president to address the team in 1971, and the legend has it that Allen used a play, a wide receiver reverse, that Nixon had suggested for a playoff game that year. The play was a disaster, a 13-yard loss that stymied a critical scoring drive and contributed to Washington's loss. Pretty interesting. I never knew that. Richard Nixon ran a failed orange juice business. In 1938, Richard Nixon and several investors attempted to strike it rich making California orange juice, but Richard had no more luck than his father in the citrus business. The future president was not just the president of the Citra Frost Company, which attempted to produce and sell frozen orange juice, but he even performed the menial work of cutting and squeezing oranges. Citra Frost's misguided attempt to freeze the juice itself, rather than the concentrate, doomed it to bankruptcy after just 18 months. Pretty cool stuff. Let's see what other facts I have for you guys. Nixon had a chance to attend Harvard, but he had to decline. As a student, Richard Nixon was 3rd in his class and was offered a tuition grant to Harvard, but he was needed at home by his family. He was an outstanding law student. After graduating from Whittier College in California, Nixon received a full scholarship to Duke Law and graduated third in his class. He was a lieutenant commander in the Navy during World War II. He served in a variety of administrative positions, but didn't see combat during his time in the Pacific. He almost became an FBI agent in the 1930s. We know that. He applied to the agency, but never heard back about his application. And he had actually been accepted, but budget cuts eliminated the position. Nixon was only 39 years old when he ran for vice president. We know that. Nixon survived two potentially fatal political losses in 1960 and 1962. Of course, the presidential campaign of 1960 to Kennedy, and then that gubernatorial race in California in 1962. Everybody thought Nixon's career was over, but obviously it was not. Here we go. This is fun. The Checker speech was partially intended as an inside joke about FDR. The national TV speech that saved Nixon's career in 1952 was a masterful political move, but the reference to Checkers the dog was meant as a jab at FDR's famous follow speech that Republicans would get. Years later, Nixon was still upset that it was called the Checker speech, and people mostly remembered the reference to his pet dog. Good old Checkers. Nixon was a Quaker. We already know that. He wanted to join the FBI. We already know that. Here we go. Richard Nixon wrote love notes to his wife-to-be. Nixon met his wife, Patricia, while the two appeared in a 1938 Whittier Community Players Theater production titled The Dark Tower. And Nixon set about courting her, writing letters that seemed uncharacteristically maudlin for the future president. He wrote, "And when the wind blows and the rains fall and the sun shines through the clouds, as it is now, he still resolves, and as he did then, that nothing so fine ever happened to him or anyone else as falling in love with thee, my dearest heart." There you go. Good old Tricky Dick, the romance man. Of course, we just talked. A dog helped save his political career. So I love this, the Checker speech. He told about his 6-year-old falling in love with the Cocker Spaniel. It was donated by a campaign supporter. He believed that any man who loved dogs couldn't be all bad. The public sentiment turned out and remained on the ticket, obviously, in 1952. It was labeled as the Checker speech, as though the mention of my dog was the only thing that saved my career, Nixon later wrote. Many of the critics glided over the fact that the fund was thoroughly explained. My personal finances laid bare, and an admittedly emotional but honest appeal made for public support. Pretty interesting stuff. Nope. Just making sure that there's nothing in part 1 that I want to tell you guys. Here's pretty interesting stuff. He once was the president of Frozen Orange Juice Company. We know that. We just talked about that. That failed. We got all that. Nixon learned to ice skate to win the heart of Pat Nixon. There are many ways to get the girl of your dreams. To win the heart of the fair Patricia Ryan Nixon, he would actually need to apply a certain level of strategic attrition. Nixon was a clever young buck, but his crooked nose and chubby Buddha cheeks were no match for the other men who also courted Pat. Nixon and Pat met as castmates, as we know, and Tricky Dick managed to drive Pat home after a few rehearsals. But then he proceeded to backtrack significantly when he was struck with a bad case of word vomit. The third night he drove her home, he had the audacity to proclaim, "Someday I'm going to marry you." And Pat laughed in response. It's fun, however, to imagine the next 2 years of Nixon's romantic pursuit playing out as a slapstick cinematic montage with the bumbling melodies of circus music playing. Shots include Nixon talking to Pat every day after practice, even when it's clear she wants to go meet another fella. Nixon driving her to and from the dates with said other fellas, and Nixon tagging along on her ice skating outings. Quick cuts of Nixon falling many, many times and getting quite bloody, for he was afraid of ice skating and very bad at it. It must have gotten cute though, because Pat grew fond of Tricky Dick and said yes when he proposed in the spring of 1940. Pretty funny. Nixon apparently was a raging alcoholic who almost slept through World War III. Plenty of people experience sleeping trouble for any number of legitimate and illegitimate reasons. Nixon, however, often could not sleep because at any given moment, American soldiers and Vietnamese civilians were indirectly dying by his hand. In his time as president, Nixon developed extreme insomnia quelled by alcohol, which led to more insomnia, which led to a destructive cycle that sometimes resulted in his inability to attend to his job in times of crisis. During a conflict known as the Yom Kippur War, Israel versus Syria and Egypt, the U.S. discovered that the Soviet Union was aiding Egypt with nuclear warheads. This war was extremely hazardous because the rising tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union could not explode in a worse place than the tumultuous Middle East. The global nuclear alert level needed to be raised to one rung below imminent nuclear war, but Nixon's aides were unable to get him sober enough to be of any help. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger had to take the lead, and luckily he was able to negotiate quickly enough before the Soviets realized the USA was making decisions without their leader. Pretty interesting. That probably should have been in part 2, but still, pretty interesting thing there. Nixon grew up a Quaker, but described Christians as victims of a cruel hoax. Remember when everyone made such a fuss about that youngin' Jack Kennedy being a Catholic when he ran for president? Well, Nixon remembered, so he sure tried to downplay his own Quaker upbringing. Experts cannot know for sure how near and dear Tricky Dick kept his Quaker values in his personal life, but as for his time in office, he kept his Christianity generic. Nixon's childhood Quakerism wasn't really that solemn, quiet, and reserved flavor of Christianity Quakerism is associated with. It was a musical, emotional, and evangelical skewing Quakerism. In World War II, Nixon did not take his Quaker exemption and join the Navy. He also started a very non-Quakerly frat in college, and before he moved to Washington, he and Pat were regulars at the Coconut Grove nightclub in Los Angeles, where the likes of Clark Gable and Katharine Hepburn partied in a non-Quaker fashion regularly. In a 1978 memoir, Nixon included a college paper that outlined his brand of Quaker beliefs and claimed that they reflected what he currently believed. Yet it was the Quakers who were the first to call for his impeachment a full 6 months before his resignation in August of 1974. American Christianity at large was not too happy with him after his tapes let slip that he thought Christians were victims of a cruel hoax. Pretty cool stuff. So there you go. I think that's pretty much it. We talked about, obviously, he could play 5 instruments. Oh, here we go. This is another good one. Nixon partly funded his first run for Congress with poker winnings. As a naval officer in the Second World War, Nixon developed a reputation as an outstanding card player. He was described by a fellow officer as the finest poker player I had ever played against. He was a latecomer to the game. Apparently, he didn't even know the rules until 1944, but he proved to be a quick learner. Nixon was known for an extremely tight style of play, rarely taking big risks, and winning small amounts regularly. He also claimed to be adept at reading the expressions of other players. And by the time he left the Navy at the end of the war, he'd won roughly the equivalent of $100,000 in today's money. When he decided to run for office in 1946, his poker winnings provided a portion of the funds and the financial freedom to run the risk of seeking office. He won easily, and the first win paved the way for his career in politics. So there you go. Pretty good stuff. There you go. that's a look at the young life, political rise, and all the good stuff, education of our 37th President of the United States, Richard Milhouse Nixon. I hope you enjoyed this part 1, and of course, stay tuned for tomorrow, part 2, as we take a look at the legacy and presidency and death of Richard M. Nixon. Thanks for joining, guys. Thanks for all the support. Thank you for the subscribes. Thank you for everything. Keep it all coming. We love it. And I will be back tomorrow with you, and we'll go over part 2. So thanks, guys. See you tomorrow. Hey guys, how's it going? TJ here, Dead History. And I am actually at a pet memorial park. Yes, so this is a pet cemetery. I'm going to flip you guys around, show you why I'm here. Because right there, that is the grave of Checkers. Yes, Richard Nixon's dog Checkers. There he is. So, of course, you know the very famous Checkers speech that I told you guys about. So there he is, and this is where he is buried. This is all the way out on Long Island in New York. So, yeah, I'm all the way out in like Wantagh area of Long Island. So it's quite a ways out. If anybody is familiar with Jones Beach on Long Island, Jones Beach is maybe 10 or 15 minutes from here. It's not far, so I'm out in that area. So there you go. Checkers Nixon. Right here. This is, like I said, a pet cemetery. These are all dogs and cats and what have you. But there you go. Checkers Nixon's gravesite. The infamous Checkers speech. The little Cocker Spaniel dog Checkers, buried here on Long Island. Checkers Nixon. Thanks for stopping in, guys.